Hey, everybody, and welcome back to the Like Stars podcast. I'm your host, Pete Goodman. Great to have you joining again for another episode as we continue to talk about the wisdom of God, the way it relates to our lives, and answering the questions that you have about life, following Jesus, scriptures, all that kind of stuff. Got some great questions that came in this week, including questions about tithing and giving, some follow-up about last episode on the law, and just some other really cool questions I want to talk about. Before we dive in, just a reminder, please go ahead and if you have any other questions, if you're listening and you're like, hey, what about this? Maybe I answer something and you're like, I want more information. Shoot me an email. Even maybe say, I don't know if I want it on the podcast, but I just want to know. Shoot me an email, pete@risecitychurch.com. You can also find me on Instagram at the Like Stars Podcast or on Facebook at Like Stars. And if you're listening on audio, make sure that you're following so you get it downloaded every week. And if you're on YouTube, please consider subscribing. And however you're listening, I would, as I always say this, I would love comments, feedback, any thoughts you might have. Please feel free to share. Would love to hear from you. Keep in mind, we're doing this, trying to connect with you guys and answer your questions. So please keep asking them, keep sending them in. I love when I get questions from you guys. So we're going to continue today, and I'm recording this right before Christmas. So I guess I'd say it's a special holiday, but it's not really. However, we do have a special holiday sponsor for this episode of the podcast. Our special holiday sponsor for this episode of the Like Stars podcast is that person who brings a terrible, crappy gift to a white elephant exchange party. You know who you are. Now, here's the deal. You are a absolute conundrum for me. You are somebody that kind of messes with my brain. And here's why. On the one hand, I really can't stand it when I have to go and buy that, pay good money for that Chili's gift card and show up at this stupid party with a real present. And then you just grabbed some old beaten pot holder out of your drawer at home and you wrapped it up as if you're giving frankincense to the baby Jesus, and you show up like, here you go. It's not fair. It's wrong. And it kind of drives me nuts. However, on the other hand, the truth is I loathe this stupid game and being forced to participate multiple times every single Christmas. Here's a fake present. Let's pass it around. Let's draw a number. No, let's not do that. So the fact that you, person who brings crappy gift, the fact that you show up and you undermine the entire thing with such an obvious example of not giving a fly in squirrel's nuts actually gives me a small sense of joy in my heart at the same time. So I kind of know what to do. The truth is, person who brings a crappy gift, you're playing chess while the rest of us are playing checkers. And I salute you. You are our sponsor for this episode of the Like Stars podcast. All right, that's all the holiday stuff we got. Let's dive into your questions that you want to talk about. First, in the spirit of giving and Christmas, I suppose, had a question about giving, tithing at the church. I want to read the question specifically, but I'm going to kind of take a bigger approach to it. The question came in and said, when it comes to tithing, can we give some to the church, some to other Christian organizations, and some in other ways? Or do we have to give all 10% to our home church? What does the scripture say about this? So the question is specifically, first and foremost, can I break up this thing we call a tithe, and can it go to different places? But before I even answer that, I want to take a bigger step back and talk about tithing a little bit in general. What is it? Where does it come from? And specifically, if you listen to our episode, last episode about the law, the Old Testament law, tithing is part of the Old Testament law. And so there's even a question of well, wait a minute. Last episode, you said that tithing or all Old Testament law isn't relevant for Christians. Is tithing relevant? Is tithing even part of a Christian's life? So we're going to talk about both of those issues together and see where they land. Okay, so to start, as I always love to do, because it's kind of where my brain's at, it's what I enjoy, I want to begin the discussion about tithing, not actually in the scriptures themselves, but in the history, the context of what we call tithing. The word tithe is an English word. It means tenth, and it's a pretty direct translation of the Hebrew that talks about giving a tenth, 10% of your stuff, your income. And so it's something that started in the Old Testament law. The Jewish people were commanded to give 10% of all of their earnings, their income. That included food and cattle and everything. And that continued kind of into the New Testament. And then for the last couple thousand years, there's always been this part of Christianity that sort of continued the tradition, giving 10% of your income. Now, what we need to understand about this idea is, first and foremost, the idea of tithing is not original to Christianity or Judaism. Tithing was a part of the ancient world, and tithing also was not originally necessarily religious in the sense that we think of it. There are examples in the ancient world of people giving this thing called a tithe to temples or places of worship to different gods. That was true. But at its core, the most common place that we see the idea of tithing was when it came to a person who was politically a vassal of a king or a ruler. So someone that you were sort of in this like relationship where they were sort of over you. And I'll get into that a little bit. Especially in the ancient Near East, where the Jewish people were first formed, Mesopotamia, newer Babylonian texts from as far back as probably the 5th or 6th century BC discuss different ways that people collected a tithe, sometimes as a means of like supporting like a temple or a sanctuary or something, but also almost as what you might even call just like a tax to a king or a ruler. The first place that we see, in fact, the word tithe in the Bible is in the book of Genesis. There's this moment where Abram's, his cousin Lot is captured in a battle, and Abram goes to rescue him. And basically, there's this little war skirmish that we read about. Abram wins it, frees his relatives. And in that moment, he comes to all this plunder and stuff because he's won this battle, this war. And there's this moment where we meet this person named Melchizedek, which was going to be the name of my fourth daughter, but my wife shot that down because she's not a good Christian. And basically, we see this moment where it says that Abram gives Melchizedek a tithe. What was likely happening here is Melchizedek was a king of one of these vassal states, and Abram was doing what people did all the time, which was giving almost like a tax to him as a king, a tenth of the plunder, which was a very common thing to do. So after he wins this battle, he was sort of, here's this king who it's sort of his land, it's his area, and instead of keeping it all, he gives like a 10% of it. And this was common in the ancient world, especially among Mesopotamians, Hittites, like that. They would often talk about paying a tithe as a tribute to what was called a vassal kingdom. And there's this great word, you may have heard it before, probably not, it's okay, a suzerain treaty. A suzerain treaty was very common in the ancient world. And the way that it worked was it would be a treaty between a stronger power and a weaker power. And the stronger power would offer protection, oversight, kind of governance, but also at the same time, a little bit of freedom. So if you were in a suzerain treaty with another power and that power was stronger than you were still free. Like you weren't their quote unquote subject, like they weren't your king, but they were kind of over you might say. This kind of thing eventually morphed over the years into like the modern day mafia. But back then it wasn't quite like that, although maybe it was. A strong state would basically demand payment for quote unquote protection or things. But the idea was when you signed a suzerain treaty, you maintained some autonomy. So you weren't completely conquered. They were sort of over you, but you were sort of free to still be your own king in your own kingdom, but you had to pay usually a tithe. So a tithe could be both a show of respect, but it was also a way of saying, I am acknowledging that this is sort of like your kingdom, your land, and here's a tenth of it. That could be in money, in goods, in plunder, whatever it was. And this seems to be the way it was first used in the Old Testament. Oftentimes, it really was a tithe was almost another way of just saying tax. We see in actually the book of Maccabees, the Seleucid kings of Syria use the word tithe to talk about the royal income that you had to pay them. But the Jews had a different use. They sort of saw it more as like a sacred tax, like giving money to God or the temple. But in some ways, what you got to understand is there's actually a big similarity there. Those aren't two completely different things, okay? It's not like one's political and one's religious, as those are two very different topics. They weren't different topics. They were very similar topics to these people. You see, for the Jewish people, they believed they had entered into a suzerain treaty with God. And in fact, the entire book of Deuteronomy is structured like a suzerain treaty. This is the past. This is where we were. This is where you were. God has stepped in and God has offered to do this for you. Here are God's terms. Do you accept God's terms? Okay, here's what you'll get as long as you follow the terms. Here's what will happen if you break the terms. The whole book of Deuteronomy sounds like a treaty between a vassal state, a king, and a subjected people. And the Jewish people saw themselves this way. As I talked about in the last episode, they saw themselves as having entered into a contract, an agreement with God, where God was their king. They would even say, no king but God. Obviously, that changed a little bit when they later decided they wanted a king, but originally it was no king but God. They were God's people. He was their subjects. And so the introduction of this idea of a tithe, it wasn't just like this religious ceremony. At its surface, it was like, this is what we do for our kings. When you have a king, you pay them money. You pay a portion of your income. And it's almost like when you read it in the Old Testament, what you're seeing is this concept of not just like, hey, when you have a king, you pay a tithe. God is your king. You're still paying a tithe. Like God saying, I don't want to just be some metaphysical, spiritual idea. I am your king. You have come into an agreement with me. And so I actually want you to treat me like a king. I want you to obey me. I want you to do what I say. And I want you to give a tithe. Almost like you and I would pay taxes to a government. Now, it's hard for us to feel that and hear that because we're like, wait, giving taxes, those are very different things. One's generosity and one is like something you owe. Well, look, I'm just telling you like it is. In the original context, the idea of a tithe wasn't generosity. It wasn't giving out of the goodness of your heart. It was an expectation that you supply this. And as far as we can tell, that was part of the deal. The Jews understood they had an expectation to pay a 10% tithe of all their income to God as a sign of allegiance and loyalty and commitment to this treaty agreement, this covenant they had made with him. So the idea of a tithe was very rooted not just in, hey, be generous people. It was rooted and grounded in these people had made this agreement with God and he was their king. They were his people. And this was part of the agreement. Now, that being said, I want to point out that in doing that, it does clearly, I have to say clearly, it definitely appears to me that part of God's reason for doing this was not because he wanted the money. He doesn't need the money. He was clearly wanting the Jewish people to see generosity and giving as part of the life he was calling them to. But the money also had practical implications because, again, politics and religion aren't separate for the Jewish people. They're the same thing. So the people who are running what you and I might think of as the religious side of things, they were called the Levites. They were the group, the family of all the tribes that was responsible to handle the things of God, to be priests and work in sanctuary. They were not allowed to have normal jobs and work normal things or own property. They lived and were supported by the tithe of the other tribes. So everybody gave a tenth, a tithe, and that actually supported the work of the priests and the temple and all these kind of things. So in a sense, it really kind of was tax in the way that you and I traditionally think of it. Just like you and I pay a tax and that pays the salary to our police officers and military and presidents and mayors, they paid a tithe and that paid for the work of all the ministry. But it also supported the poor, helped those in need. The Old Testament is full of laws. The Torah is full of places that actually ask them to go beyond just tithing, to forgive debts and to help the poor, to care for the widow. But at its core, it was all focused on remembering that God was king and this was part of their agreement. So that is the understanding, the root of the idea of a tithe in the Old Testament. It was an Old Testament law. What does that mean for you and I? Well, as I've said many times on this podcast, and I'm sure however long I end up doing it, you'll hear it a bunch more times. I'm not dealing with absolutes here. I'm not dealing with what we might call core salvation issues. This is an area that we can agree to disagree on. If I say something you're like, I don't agree with that, we're not in the realm of you have to believe this kind of stuff. But I want to give you my take on it and try to offer the best way forward I can. I made this comment in the last podcast, and I want to stand behind it. Christians are not bound by Old Testament law. The Old Testament laws were for the Jewish people who made a quote unquote suzerain covenant treaty with God. You and I haven't. We have entered into a new covenant agreement through Jesus, and our fidelity, our faithfulness to God, our living up to our contract that we signed is by obeying Jesus and being led by his Spirit. So first and foremost, the rule of life that we can follow as Christians is Old Testament law is not, I'll use this big word, binding. It's not, no, you must do that. We look for the teachings of Jesus in the New Testament and maybe the parts of the Old Testament law that might speak to moral or ethical issues. Clearly giving and being generous is a moral or ethic issue, and that's clearly interpreted and reinterpreted and re-brought out all over the New Testament. There's no question that God calls his people to be generous, but tithing is not specifically reiterated in the New Testament. There's one place where it is mentioned, and it's when Jesus is critiquing the Pharisees, who were Jewish leaders. And he was saying, you guys are so detailed, so specific in your tithing. You take the smallest little spices even, and you make sure you're exactly 10%. But you forget the important things of the law: justice, mercy, kindness. And Jesus says, you should have practiced the former without neglecting the latter. Meaning, yeah, you were supposed to tithe, but you missed the most important thing. Now, let me break that down just briefly, because some people would say, well, Pete, right there, Jesus just said you're supposed to tithe, so you're supposed to tithe. Well, I actually would disagree with that interpretation. Here's why. Jesus was talking to Jewish Pharisees who were still part of the old covenant. And he said, part of your agreement with God was to tithe. But a bigger part of your agreement with God was to seek justice, to be faithful, to love, and be kind. So yeah, you should have done the parts you were supposed to do, but you ignored the parts you were really supposed to do. That entire statement by Jesus was directed at Jewish people. It wasn't he wasn't making a general statement for all humanity. He didn't turn and look at all of his followers and says, I want all of you to tithe 10% of your income. He was talking to Jewish people and said, under the agreement you made, you're doing what you're supposed to do there, but you weren't doing what you're supposed to do there. What I have stated in the previous podcast, I'll reiterate it, is with Jesus, none of us are bound to those Old Testament laws. So Jesus would never look at us and say, well, you were supposed to do this, this, and this. The Old Testament says it. No, he said, come follow me, obey me. There's nowhere in Scripture that Jesus or any of his followers directly say to us, tithe 10% of your income. So theologically, I would argue that tithing 10% of your income is not a biblical command. If you would read that passage and say, no, I think Jesus was telling me to do it. Cool. I mean, this is not a hill to die on. But let me take it a step further. I say that, but I also say this. My wife and I absolutely give 10% of our income. I have given 10% of my income for as long as I've been following Jesus. Every paycheck, I give 10% to the local church. And I'm not trying to be like braggadocious here. I'm just being honest. We usually give more than 10%, but we give 10% to the local church. What I want you to hear in this, though, is really the heart behind where I'm getting at. When I say it's not an Old Testament law, I'm saying we're not bound by this like legalistic, if you don't do this, you're not whatever. There are some things that Jesus definitely says. I expect this of you, do it. But when it comes to being generous, what the New Testament really gets at is what the law was pointing to was that, number one, we would treat God as king, which that's faith in Jesus, he's king, he's Lord, and we would become the kind of people we're created to be, which clearly includes generosity. It clearly includes taking our resources that we have and joining the fight, so to speak. So by being engaged, being a part of the mission requires sometimes sharing my time, my resources, and my money. There's nowhere in the New Testament that I feel like you can escape the idea that you and I are called to give money to the movement and the mission of God. It's all over. Paul doesn't say you don't have to give. Paul just says you need to pray in your own heart and decide what you want to give. So right there, Paul's kind of releasing you from this quote unquote 10%, but he's not releasing you from being generous. You are absolutely expected as a follower of Jesus to be generous with your money. And I believe there's an expectation, and we see it in Paul's letters and in the book of Acts. There's an expectation that you and I as Christians are supposed to, just like the Jews, use our resources to support the work of the ministry. I recognize that I work for a church, and therefore when you guys tithe to my church, you're paying my salary. And so me talking in this microphone and saying, tithe money, of course it makes a lot of sense. Why wouldn't I say that? But I want you to know I would say it whether I worked here or not, and I tithed long before I worked at this church. I believe it is part of a Christian's responsibility to help fund the movement of God on the earth. And I think the way that the tithe was used to take care of the needs of the priesthood and the temple now translates to the way that giving at the church takes care of people like me and other pastors, and keeping the lights on in our church buildings and paying for ways that we go out and reach our community. So the question is not generosity. The question is not giving. I think those are just, I don't think you can escape those. The question is, does it have to be the number 10%? And I would say, no, it doesn't have to be. However, I think the beauty of a number is it gives you a baseline. It gives you something to sort of, okay, here's where I'm going to go. I think that 10% is a really good idea. I know that God wants me to be generous. I know that he wants me to support the work of the ministry. And in the Old Testament, they gave 10%. I'm like, well, if they can do it, I can do it. I do not give 10% of my income because of some Old Testament law that I feel like I have to obey. I give 10% of my income because I want to live a generous life, and I want to be a person who is supporting and behind what God is doing on the earth. And if you feel otherwise, if you're like, I don't want to give 10%, I want to give 8%, that's up to you and your own conscience. If you say, I don't want to give anything, well, then you and I are not listening to the same spirit, because God has called us to give. Tithing is an Old Testament law that isn't quote unquote binding for you, but being generous and supporting the work of the church is part of being loyal and allegiant to King Jesus. And I think 10% is a great number. I would say this: if you're out there and you're like, I'm thinking about giving, I don't know, give 10%, do it. And if you're like, Pete, I don't want to give it to your church, don't give it to my church. I don't care. So really getting to the question, well, do I have to give it all to a church? No, I don't think that's biblical in the New Testament. It wasn't even in the Old Testament. It didn't all go to the Levites. Some of it went to help the poor in other places. The point here is that you're generous. The point here is that you're bought in. The point here is that you're putting your money where your mouth is and saying, I believe that God has called me to join him in the Great Commission, and I'm going to give my time and my talents and my money to it. And giving 10% is just a great place to start. I think wisdom, and remember we've talked about how wisdom is different than law. I think wisdom would call us to find a decent, healthy number, and 10% is a good, healthy number, and say, I'm going to make this a practice in my life and commit to it. And so that's what I do. And I would encourage you to do the same thing. At whatever church you attend, if you're not attending a church, start attending a church. Get plugged in, get involved. Don't sit on the sidelines. And yes, I know it can be abused. I know churches can take the money and do dumb stuff with it. So, be wise. If you think your church is wasting your money and doing dumb stuff with it, you know what? Talk to the pastor, find out, get some information. And if you don't feel good about it, then, maybe find a church that you do feel comfortable at. I'm not telling you to jump churches, but I do. If it's keeping you from being generous, there's a problem that you need to work through, because we are called to be generous and give, whatever percentage that you feel like the Spirit's leading you to give. All right. I want to answer another question. That was the first one. I had a great lunch with a friend today, and he asked me some follow-up questions from my last podcast, and I thought it was really good. In the last podcast, I talked about how there were really two basic uses or reasons for the Old Testament law. There was the moral or ethical side, and then there was the part that was to stand out and be seen by the rest of the world. And he said to me, he's like, Pete, I've actually been taught there were three parts to it, and I'm wondering what you think. What about the side of it that was ceremonial or had to do with ritual purity in the temples? Is that not part of the Old Testament law? And as soon as he asked me the question, I was like, I'm so glad you said that. I was thinking when I finished last episode that I wish I had talked about that. I actually, like, at night I was laying in bed, I'm like, oh, doggone it, I should have said that. And so I'm like, you know what? I'm going to go ahead and use that as another question on this episode. The truth is, if you've already listened to the last episode on breaking the law, the Old Testament law, this will apply. If you haven't heard it, go back and listen to it, and then you come back and it'll make sense here. Yes. The answer is yes. The answer is yes. I should have said in my last episode, there really are 3 purposes for the law. There are moral or ethical guidelines. Don't murder, don't steal. There are outward appearance things so the Jewish people would stand out, what they couldn't eat, don't work on the Sabbath, how to cut your hair, circumcision. But then there were also laws that we would call ritual purity. They were related to keeping the temple holy. The book of Leviticus is full of these. There are a number of laws in the Old Testament whose primary purpose or reason is maintaining the presence of God. So whenever you see the words clean or unclean, sometimes pure or impure in the Old Testament, don't think sinful, bad versus holy or good. That's not how it works. Being clean or unclean had nothing to do with being good or bad or sinful or not sinful. Being clean or unclean meant whether you were allowed to approach the Holy of Holies, like the temple. Only certain things could be near the holiness of God in the Old Testament. So there were a number of rules in the Old Testament law that weren't about you being a good person and had nothing to do with what the outside world said. They had everything to do with whether or not this was appropriate to be near the holy place of God. That might be a whole discussion by itself. For those of you that have taken my Rise to Life class here at Rise City, I talk about that. But in some ways, the purity laws were almost I hate to say this, but maybe in kind of a quote unquote spiritual sense, almost like keeping contamination out, maybe. And now that's weird. I don't like necessarily saying that because some of this stuff is like, how is that contaminating? But things like touching a dead body, being sick, having lesions, sometimes just even doing something wrong or in an inappropriate order. There were very specific rules for how to approach the presence of God. Some theologians would argue that's because God wanted them to take it very seriously and have this is a big deal. Very, very possible. But here's why I didn't mention it last week. Partly it kind of slipped my mind, but also what I was getting at in the last episode was the parts of the law that were really for everybody. Every Jewish person understood there were moral and ethical guidelines. Don't covet, don't take your neighbor's wife. And then there were things that this makes me look Jewish. Don't wear this kind of clothing, whatever, don't eat pork. However, not every Jewish person spent a lot of time thinking about ritual purity. When you read the Old Testament laws, like the book of Leviticus, you might be inclined to think, oh my gosh, how on earth did people live like this? They're like constantly washing and taking baths and, you can't do this and you can't do that. If you touch a dead body, you're unclean. Like, how can anyone live this way? Look, this is so important. Those rules were mostly for the Levites of the tribe of Levi who oversaw the temple. They were responsible to know those rules. They were the ones that were going into the temple and doing all the work. The average normal Jewish person wasn't worried about that stuff that much. It wasn't part of their normal daily life. Yes, later there were some certain groups or hyper-religious sects that broke off and wanted to follow them with purity of the Essenes. But for the most part, the average Jewish person wasn't that concerned with ritual purity because the average Jewish person wasn't spending a lot of time in the temple. You may go there, some people maybe go there 2 or 3 times their whole life if they're far away. People that are close, maybe once a year. So these rules, the reason why I didn't really even include them, the entire book of Leviticus is mostly written to the Levites. It was almost like their guidebook. I made this analogy when I was having lunch with a friend today. We're talking about it. I said, it's kind of like you and I. We know that we have to pay taxes. We know there are tax laws. And when it's tax season, we know like we have to type in some stuff or talk to our accountant and then here's how much you have to pay. But none of us really have the tax code memorized. Most of us don't anyway. We kind of like let the CPAs and our accountants worry about that. That's how it was being Jewish. You knew about the moral and ethical ones. You knew about the external ones that made you look Jewish. But a lot of the specific ones about ritual purity, it was like, well, the Levites and the priests know a lot about that. If I need to know, they'll tell me. If I come to the temple and they ask, have you touched a dead body? I know I can't come in. But those weren't part of a normal Jewish person's regular daily life. They were part of the small group of people that actually worked in the temple. At one point, maybe you wanted to go to the temple, and so it would affect you. But again, for the most part, even then, it's not like they were reading the book of Leviticus. Most of them probably never read it in their life. But if they went to the temple, the priest might say, I've read the book of Leviticus. It says this, here's what you can and can't do. So I didn't include it in the last episode because it really isn't for the average person, but it is true. There really are 3 parts to the Old Testament law: moral and ethical guidelines for everybody, the parts that made the Jewish people stand out and be distinct, and then the ritual purity rules about how to approach God, who is clean, who's unclean, who can go into the temple, who can't go into the temple, and when. But again, those were more specific rules for smaller occasions for less people, so not a part of a normal person's everyday life. Okay. Hopefully that makes sense. Well, we're still going on here. I guess we could ask a few more questions. Let me get to another one. I had another friend of mine from Wichita. He sent me an Instagram question that he and his wife were talking about. It was pretty interesting. He told me, I'm going to read the whole question here and then talk it through. He said, we heard about a guy who claimed to have gone to hell. And while there, he asked God why. And God said, because you have unforgiveness in your heart. This brought up a discussion on Matthew 6:14-15, which is a verse that Jesus says, if you forgive, God will forgive you. If you don't forgive, God won't forgive you. And he said, we both believe, my wife and I, we are saved by grace through faith, not through what you do. But I've always thought of this verse. So the question is, wait a minute, if we're saved by grace, not by what we do or don't do, what does Jesus mean that if I don't forgive, I won't be forgiven? So is it like, for the most part, it doesn't matter what you do, but forgiveness, that's the one thing. And here's this guy who went to hell, and God said the reason you're in hell is because of unforgiveness. So is that the one sin that if we do that sin, we're in trouble? There's a couple things I want to unpack with this question, and appreciate you sending it in, Sean. First of all, let me start with, I guess, maybe the behind the scene part of this question. And I want to be careful here how I say this because I don't want to offend anyone. Maybe I do. No, I don't. I think that it is unwise to build theological beliefs or stances on people's near-death or after-death experiences. So let me just start there. I will never hold a belief or ascribe to something and say, this is what I believe because somebody said they died and went to heaven or went to hell or something and told me it's what they saw. For one, it's pretty much a proven fact that a lot of people lie about that. I mean, there was a whole book that came out a while ago about a kid who went to heaven, and a few years later he came out and said he made it up and his dad told him to write it all down so he could make money. I don't put a lot of stock in those kind of things. Now, I'm not a complete skeptic in the sense that I'm not sitting here saying that never happens. No one has ever died and experienced the presence of God, but then been resuscitated and lived to tell about it. I'm not saying that doesn't happen, okay? Please, I'm not saying that doesn't happen. I'm just saying I'm not going to build my theology off it. Because even the ones that seem kind of convincing, a lot of times they disagree. There's like 4 or 5 different people I've heard who say they have had that story and they all tell a different picture. Like, well, I saw this and I saw this, and some don't even agree. I just think it's dangerous. I'm going to build my theology off of the scriptures and the testimony of the church in general, not off of somebody's death experience. Okay. First and foremost. Secondly, even when someone says that they died and they went and saw Jesus or something, I'm like, okay, I assume that if you died, you'd see Jesus. When someone says they died and went to hell, I'm like, well, when I read the scriptures, it says hell happens after judgment. And it's like a final judgment place that you're thrown into. So did you really go to hell? Did God judge you? And if he judged you and you went to hell, how did you come back alive again? There's a lot of problems there. Is it possible that it was a vision that God just wanted to speak to him? Maybe, sure. All that being said, when somebody says, I died and this is what I experienced, so believe X, Y, Z, I'm always like, you know what? You may have had an experience, but it may be true, but I'm not building theology off of it. All right, that's my first point. Let's talk about the verse itself. If you forgive, your Father in heaven will forgive you. If you don't forgive, your Father won't forgive you. There are 2 things that we need to talk about briefly as we wrap up here. First, whenever you run into a conflicting or difficult passage, difficult, this one lands somewhere in there. it's important to say, what is the overall message of the Bible, first and foremost? And if what you think this means is in complete contradiction to what tons and tons of other verses say, then maybe you need to step back and rethink what it's being said, or at least kind of process it more. And this is an interesting example because it's not black and white. This is a tough one because, yes, it is true that we are told we're not saved by works of Torah. We're not saved by doing the things of the law. We're saved by God's grace, by having faith in him. But as I've said on this podcast, and I'll say it many times, having faith in him is not nothing. Having faith in him is loyal allegiance. It's obedience. It's following him. It's giving your life to him. It's entering into a relationship. So we're saved by following Jesus. It's grace that allows us to follow Jesus. Maybe I'll do a whole podcast on the word grace. That might be a good one. So if part of being a Christian and being in and being part of his kingdom is obeying and following him, then yeah, for him to say, if you want in, if you want to be a part of this, a big part of it is forgiveness. You can't say that you're a follower of me. Like, remember he said, why do you call me Lord, Lord, and not do what I say? I think we underestimate those kind of statements. Don't call me Lord and not obey me. If you have no interest in actually following me and doing what I said, you're not actually part of my kingdom. And I think as Christians or people who call themselves Christians, we need to hear that and think about it. What makes you a Christian is not a belief you hold in the back of your head. What makes you a Christian is your loyal commitment to Jesus as Lord and Savior of your life. And that means changing the way that you live and following and obeying him. And experiencing the life he has for you doesn't happen because you believe some stuff to be true about him. It happens because you obey him and you do what he says. And one of the things he has said again and again and again is you must forgive others as you've been forgiven. So on one hand, I would say, yeah, be cautious that we're not overreading it. But I would also say, yeah, a person who refuses to forgive is not loyally following Jesus. It's a big deal to him. He tells a whole parable in Matthew 18 about a wicked servant who's forgiven a huge debt by a king or a ruler. And then he turns around and strangles this guy that owed him a few bucks. He's like, don't be that person. You've been forgiven much by God. You is expected that you forgive much yourself. That's part of being a follower of Jesus. I love how N.T. Wright says, forgiveness for Christians is like air in your lungs. You can't hold it in. If you hold it in, you suffocate. It's got to come back out. You breathe it in, you breathe it out. You breathe in God's forgiveness. You breathe out his forgiveness to others. Like that's part of following Jesus. So being a follower of Jesus involves forgiveness. It's part of the deal. It's par for the course. If you're in this kingdom, you forgive. That's part of what it's about. Now, and I'll end with this. At the same time, I want wisdom seeks some balance here. Yes, that is part of being a Christian. The same way how we treat each other, how we behave sexually, all these different things are part of being a Christian, okay? What I don't want you to think, and I don't think Jesus was getting at this, especially because the rest of the story, I think Jesus was probably sometimes, speaking over the top a little bit, being a little stronger than normal to really make a point. What you don't want to fall into is this insecurity of, well, what if there's like one sin in my heart and I get hit by a bus? And I mentioned this in a previous episode. Like, well, what if I don't forgive this one person or I'm in the process and I haven't quite done it yet and I die tomorrow? Do I go to hell? That to me is completely also misunderstanding the entire Christian life. The Christian life, as I've mentioned before, it's more like being married. It's entering into a relationship. And yes, there are going to be rocky moments. There are going to be times that you and your wife fight. There are going to be times that you and your husband don't agree on things, or you're in a bad mood and you need some space or whatever. It doesn't make you divorced. But to be in a healthy marriage requires forgiveness and love and kindness to each other. And if there's none of that there, the marriage is failing and it's not real. In the same way, I think what Jesus was getting at is you need to be living a life of forgiveness. There needs to be an attitude of forgiveness at the core of who you are and what it means. You're committed to Jesus, and therefore you're committed to loving and forgiving others. If you're not living that way, if that's not part of who you are, then you're not actually part of this kingdom. You're not really his follower. But just as you could list any sin that way and say, well, there's always moments you're going to be weak, right? So I think if you look at a verse like that and you say, oh man, if I forget to forgive somebody and I die, I'm going to hell. That's not his point. It's not like this one moment thing, like, oh, I made this one mistake and then I got struck by lightning and now I'm going to hell. No. We're talking about your life. We're talking about the whole of it. We're talking about the way that you live, your approach to things. There's always going to be moments that you fall. It's not like every sin, suddenly you're out of the kingdom. It doesn't work that way. He's talking about, are you the kind of person who's choosing to follow him and being a forgiving person and living that kind of life? And sometimes that's hard. And sometimes there might be one situation where you need some time and it's like, I need a few days to get over this one or whatever. Maybe it's some therapy or talking with a pastor or something. But moving towards that place of forgiveness is what it means to be committed to the message of Jesus. And if you're not committed to the message of Jesus, you're not part of the kingdom, period. You're just a person who says you believe stuff that you don't really believe because you're not doing it. That was heavy, but whatever. Okay. That's it for this episode of the Like Stars podcast. It's already gotten a little bit long. Thanks so much again for joining. Thanks. As I'm kind of wrapping up the year here and, it's Christmas this week, and I've really enjoyed doing this. I really have, and thank you for everyone who's been listening and supporting. Thank you for those of you that send in questions. If you ever feel like maybe you're bothering me by sending in questions, I want you to know getting questions from you guys is seriously like one of the highlights of my day. When I get an email or a message and it's someone with a question or wants to talk about the podcast, I'm like, oh, great. I'll like put everything aside, please. And listen, another thing. If you're out there and you're like, I got a bunch of questions and I would just love to talk to you, let me know. I am game. I am down. Let's grab lunch. Let's talk. Let's get some coffee. I'll set up a Zoom call. I am here however I can help you guys. And I just so appreciate that you're listening, that you're watching, but I really would love to engage with you. Leave a comment. Say something on, if I said something on this episode and you're like, what about this or what about that? Or, say something. I want to hear from you. I really, really do enjoy it. I love it. If you know anyone else who could benefit from it, maybe someone that wrestles with the question of tithing or giving, and you could forward this to him and share it and just say, hey, check this out. However it can be a resource, I'm glad to be a part of that. Thank you all so much. I really have, it's been fun. It's been a lot of fun. Looking forward to the next year and starting back up. And there's so many more questions that I get to talk about. We'll be doing stuff in this next year on the word grace. I've said many times I'm still going to do something on end times. And I definitely want to get to a common question about predestination and things like that. So got a lot of good stuff to talk about in upcoming episodes. So stay tuned, stay subscribed, keep following, all that good stuff, and have a very Merry Christmas. And if you're listening to this after Christmas, which most of you are, well, I hope you had a good one. And if not, hope next Christmas, 12 months from now, is good too. All right, have a great one. We'll see you next time. Thanks, guys. Bye.
You consume me and I'm burning alive. When you're near